The doctor stood in the square for some time after number 13 vanished, just to make sure it didn't come back again. It didn't. The lure of the biosphere had been too much for it, just as I.M. Foreman had predicted. The doctor knelt down and ran his fingers through the dust. It could have been his imagination, but even the dust felt different now, as if it no longer wanted to cling to everything it touched. This time tomorrow, thought the doctor, this town's going to be covered in grass. Grass or something very much like it. One of the many plant species that I.M. Foreman had ingested into his body over the years, and that had been stored in the biology of number 13.
It wasn't such a bad sort, really,
the doctor told the dust.
It didn't want to hurt anybody. It just wanted to be everybody. And it got what it wanted. How many people can say that, eh?
Then he stood and clapped the dust off his hands. There was someone standing in the square when he turned round, and at first he thought it was Sarah, disobeying instructions as usual. But Sarah didn't carry a gun, and he'd never known her to wear a hat either. Magdalena stepped out into the square and stopped a few yards in front of the doctor. She still had both hands clamped around that shotgun of hers. Her face was as taut as ever, with the ever-present grey dust ground into the wrinkles around her mouth. The doctor smiled at her. Magdalena didn't smile back.
"It's over,"
he said. Magdalena's expression didn't change. "Over," she repeated. The doctor nodded.
"The remote won't be bothering you again, Magdalena, and I think you'll find that this planet's a much more hopeful place to live after today."
He glanced around the square, seeing blank, empty eyes staring out from the boarded-up buildings. Could they feel it, he wondered? Could they feel the change in the dust yet?
"You might want to think about changing the name of the place," the doctor added. "I don't think dust is going to be very appropriate from now on. This is number 13's world now. Foreman's world."
He turned back to Magdalena, but Magdalena was still just standing there, staring at him. "You're a time traveler, aren't you?" The doctor found himself scratching the back of his neck.
"Yes, well, that's going to be rather hard to explain, I'm afraid."
"That's why you came here. The show people were all time travelers. More time travelers there are in a place, the more turn up. Like you, like the remote, like those two grey things that got nailed up in the desert."
Something of a simplification, but essentially true, yes.
Magdalena stopped staring at him then and swept her eyes across the sky. It didn't seem quite as yellow as it had done, the doctor noted, which made him wonder what number 13 was doing to the atmosphere. It was a quick worker, no doubt about it.
"Remote are gone. The show's gone." "Yes."
"They all dead?"
No, not dead. I suppose you could say they've all gone underground."
Magdalena nodded.
"Been buried, that's what you're saying?"
It wasn't hard to work out what she meant by that. On dust, buried must have been the word they used to mean gone for good.
"Well, I suppose so, yes,"
the doctor agreed. "I told you, didn't I?" said Magdalena. There was a tone in her voice the doctor couldn't quite place, something that didn't sound as tired as everything else on this planet. "Anyone tries to hurt this town, I have to take it out. That's what I said, remember?" The doctor furrowed his brow.
"I'm sorry, I don't understand."
"You people, you time travelers, you bring things here, bad things. Just you being in this town, that's putting us in danger." The doctor started shaking his head, then realized he was lying. All those species that want me dead, he thought. All those enemies who want to bring me down at any cost. The Master would never have thought about going to Earth if I hadn't been there. And how many people did he murder once he got there? How many people died just because I happened to be in the vicinity? The doctor attracted things, just like the traveling show had attracted him back in 1963.
"Yes," he admitted. "Yes, I'm afraid you're right. But I'm leaving now. I've just got to make sure the biosphere is stable, and then we can—"
"No," said Magdalena.
"Sorry."
The doctor felt somewhat taken aback by that.
"No?"
"Buried," said Magdalena. "Got to see you buried. Can't leave any trace of you here, or there'll be more. More like you, or more like the remote. Can't take the chance."
Like I said, sorry."
The doctor sighed.
"I really don't want to cause you people any trouble," he said.
"I know," said Magdalena. Then she raised the shotgun, aimed it at the doctor's chest, and fired. Sarah found him eventually. It had taken her a lot longer than usual to ignore his instructions, to leave the TARDIS and come looking for him, which was ironic under the circumstances. To be honest, he had no idea how long he'd been lying there, with the sky getting darker over his head and the blood making bigger and bigger smudges across his shirt. Every now and then he'd sense the townspeople moving close to him, crawling from the rotting woodwork of their homes and watching him die from their doorsteps. But none of them had tried to help him. Whenever any of them had passed by the part of the square where he'd fallen, they'd seemed to move very, very slowly. Which was only to be expected, the doctor supposed, seeing as how he'd slowed down every part of his body that he still had some degree of control over. On the plus side, he'd brought his pulse down to a crawl, so he hadn't suffered as much blood loss as he might have done. On the minus side, this had stretched out his final moments until he couldn't exactly remember what it felt like to be alive. The real irony was that he could feel the life in the dirt underneath him, as number 13 went about its work and rebuilt the planet from the inside. If he didn't get back to the TARDIS in time, his body would probably be feeding the grass in a week or so. It seemed odd somehow that he was going to be the very last casualty of the planet Dust. He felt himself being pulled upright. Sarah was kneeling by his side now, trying to rest his head in her lap, gasping into his ear while she stroked his hair. He wasn't sure what she was saying, but he doubted she knew either. Random words of consolation, probably. She sounded like a 6-year-old, doing her best not to burst out crying. Poor girl. He felt every cell in his body go into spasm, then relax again, giving up the last of his energy. The cells didn't have the strength to keep him together anymore. He remembered feeling the same thing, just before his first regeneration. That moment of weakness when your body tried to tell you that being solid was overrated anyway, that it'd be much easier to let yourself melt back into primordial soup. Back at the academy, the students like to say that a Time Lord who died his final death would degenerate into a sticky puddle, leaving nothing behind but an ugly stain and the memories in the Matrix. It suddenly occurred to him that he had no idea whether this was actually true. "It's all right," Sarah was saying, finally managing to put proper sentences together. She didn't sound as though she believed a word of it. "You're going to be all right. I'm going to get you back to the TARDIS." The doctor shook his head. "Too late," he said, and his voice was as dry as the dust, as quiet as the desert. "This is the end, I'm afraid. Not quite how I imagined it, but..." He felt the cracks in his throat and heard the sand sticking to his words. Sarah held him tighter, so he could feel his biofield rubbing against hers. "You can't die," she told him. He could imagine her saying the same thing to her first pet hamster, moments before it passed out of her life for good. "You can't. Not now. Not like this. Please." But the doctor couldn't see her at all now, not through the cocoon of pure life force his body was building around itself, keeping him safe and warm during the time of crisis. This was what the TARDIS had been trying to warn him about then. The old girl had known it'd end this way. Still, how could he have understood? The rules were different here. Dust wasn't the kind of place he would ever have chosen to go. He had a funny feeling that all that was to change soon. The doctor felt his hand brush against something. Sarah was squeezing it, he realized, pressing his fingers against her face. He thought he felt a spot of liquid there, warm and sticky against her cheek. One of those little details that made the pain of existence worthwhile, really.
A tear, Sarah Jane?
It'd be nice to record that those were the last words he said to her, before the change began in earnest and the third Doctor effectively ceased to exist. However, there was one more thing he managed to say. One more message he felt he had to pass on to the world before he slipped away.
This is wrong.
Then he died in the dust.